My name is Stephanie Gilbert. I am a sales director for AT&T. My grandfather is my Patriot ancestor, and his name was Arthur Stanley Gilbert. And I do not know what his rank was, but he served in the Army Corps of Engineers in World War One. And my research indicates that he served through waterworks. So he was responsible for piping and trenches. My grandfather was, young at the time. He was born in 1897. So, he would have been roughly, say, 20 years old at the time, and he was newly married, and was, just went off, I assume, to do what he felt was his duty, the right thing to do. I don't think he did it for any reasons other than that he wanted to serve. My great-great-grandfather, who would have been my grandfather's father-in-law, served in the Civil War. And so that was another connection to the military. He was indeed a German, and he was also a surgeon. And so he served as an ambulance driver in the Civil War. Well, originally of his service, I didn't know much of anything. He never talked about the war. I had my grandfather with me until I was about 23, and never knew that he was in World War One. It never came up in conversation. However, I moved into his house after he passed away. And I was in the basement, and I started to find things that I attributed to military service, such as a helmet, such as a uniform that was saved in a very large canister that I had to unlock, that I found in the garage. I didn't know anything about it, so I put everything back and left it where it was. And it wasn't until years later, when I became very interested in family history and genealogy, that I again pulled out the uniform and showed it to some people and asked them what that meant. And suddenly there was a lot of interest in this uniform and the insignias on it. And most of the interest was centered around the fact that my grandfather was African American, but the uniform indicated that he was serving in a branch of the war where African Americans were not serving at the time. So I started to conduct research on his enlistment into the military, and we found that he enlisted as a white man. So the artifacts that I have include the uniform that I found. So what I've brought with me today is his coat, as well as a shirt and a pair of pants. And then in addition to that, when I was clearing the estate for one of my other relatives who passed away, I was sliding open some doors down by their fireplace just to peek in, and I found silk boxes in there. And they were keepsake boxes from, the 1910 to 1930 era. And in those boxes I found some letters, including postcards from France, from World War One, some other letters, and some war insurance, military insurance paperwork. So little things. And I also found a prayer book, which had been given to my grandfather by his brother-in-law, wishing him well in his service. We had several ancestors in the family who had passed for white at various times, not through their entire lives, but for various purposes they would pass for white. Some of them did go off and disappear into, what my family calls the white world, which means that they went and completely passed for white and never returned to the family. And the indication was that, they were living their lives as white people and had families that didn't even know, spouses and children that didn't know that they were indeed African American. But my grandfather didn't. He still remained true to himself, except for opportunities such as going into the military. There was also a story about my father, who went to rent an apartment in downtown Philadelphia at the Plaza at the time, which is now a hotel on the Parkway. And my father was an attorney in the city of Philadelphia, but he had brown skin, and such that they told him there were no apartments available. So my grandfather went down and posed as a white man and inquired about an apartment. And indeed, there were apartments available. So he told them that he would be renting an apartment and that his son, and he brought my father in, would be living there. So in situations like that, he made use of his appearance. I've been doing a lot of research around one of my ancestors. He would have been my grandfather's grandfather. And so his name was Oliver Cromwell Gilbert. He had prior been Oliver Kelly, and he was a fugitive slave. So he had been enslaved in Maryland for his life up until the age of 16. And he successfully escaped and changed his name to Gilbert. And he was a brown-skinned man, and he indeed was the grandfather of my grandfather. So on the day that my grandfather was going off to war, the family, I don't know where they went, but somewhere I assume in Philadelphia or New Jersey, they went to see my grandfather off. However, because he was passing for white, they couldn't allow any of the brown-skinned family members to attend this send-off. So Oliver didn't understand this. I don't think anyone shared with him that my grandfather was passing to go into the military. Perhaps he wouldn't have liked that idea. So they decided that to keep Oliver away from the send-off, they would take him out the night before and get him very drunk, and with hopes that the next morning he would not wake up and wouldn't show up at the send-off. And indeed, they were successful at that. Well, I just think it's interesting that my grandfather was willing to change his race formally for the purpose of serving in the military. It's not something that I really understand, especially in today's environment where it seems so dangerous to be in the military. So to sacrifice so much just to be part of it and just to serve your country, where the juxtaposition of not being allowed to serve because of your race, but instead wanting to serve, so you change your race just so you can do it, seems contradictory to me. You would think that if the military says we're not interested in having you serve because of your race, you would just be okay with that, right? And say, great, fine, glad I don't have to do that. But instead, he wanted to do it. So he made great sacrifices, including, changing part of who he was formally in order to be able to do that. I think what I've come away with from this research is learning that my family is pretty resilient in finding ways, especially at that time. They were very resilient in finding ways to make a life for themselves. What really was an unusual life that they made look usual. So behind the scenes, there was a lot going on. They had to really think through strategies and scenarios that most of the rest of the world never had to consider. My son, who's 28, is more interested now in the family history, and I hope what they take away from it is a sense of importance, right? That they understand the contributions that the family has made and that they have big shoes to fill, and there's a lot that's expected of them because a lot has been sacrificed so they can have what they have today.